Ladies and gents, good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to this RBS and NatWest Mentors webinar on intentional inclusion and how should I embrace diversity and inclusion at work. It's a pleasure to have you on board. I can't believe this is our Q3. Unbelievably quick, this year's going by, our Q3 webinar. So again, welcome. I'm recording the session. So first and foremost, if I may, just let me go through some housekeeping and then on to some introductions. We've safeguarded an hour, so make sure the dogs and the cats are in the garden with some water, the doorbell's unplugged, you've not got an Amazon delivery coming. I'm not expecting the fire alarms to go off, so I've just dedicated this hour especially to you. Throughout the presentation, you may have questions. Please ask as many questions as you need. So in the chat, you can click on the chat, type in a question. You can do it anonymously or you can put your name to it. And if there's a question that you think, actually, I'd like the answer to that, you can put a thumb up and we will look at that in more detail. So I'm pleased to say I'm joined today with my co-host, the lovely Lucy Coombs. Lucy, you there behind the scenes somewhere?
I am here, Paul. Hi, everybody.
Brilliant to have Lucy on board. And our two guest speakers. So before I give an introduction to our guest speaker, we have lots of questions about the slides and the recordings. My only request is, if you complete the survey, once you close down this webinar, you'll go into our mailing list and the slides will be sent to you. So as long as you complete that short registration, that short questionnaire, then we will send you the recordings by email. Reach out with your questions, as I've said. Make sure you populate that chat. Lucy will be in the background harvesting all those questions. A word to the wise, this isn't a session to give legal advice. If you do need some legal advice, please by all means get in touch with us. So this is very much broad scope, looking at the wider topic, okay? But if you do need us, you know where we are. Our guest speakers for today. Well, our first one is Katie Wildig. Now, Katie and I have worked together for years. Katie is one of our advice and consultancy managers. Katie is one of our dark secrets. We often have conversations, Katie and I, just to toy through a case or it might be an issue. So I'm really pleased and proud to say that we've got Katie with us today, giving us her legal perspective, which has been brilliant. We've also got the superb Stefan Springham. Now, calling Stefan, he told me, Paul, it's not Stefan, it's Steph. So it's Steph Springham. Steph is one of our very good and amazing diversity, equality, inclusion consultants within NatWest. So the entirety of our workforce managers would go to Steph for advice, for strategic planning, for just, I want to talk through a situation with you. So again, keep those questions coming. If you think of a question, raise it. We've safeguarded 25 minutes or so at the end. So we're going to do a bit of a fireside chat where we'll bring some of these questions to life. And if you've got a question at the end and we can get it in, then please, by all means, ask away. All right. So come on, enough of me waffling. Without further ado, Katie, can I hand over to you?
Of course you can. Of course you can. First of all, thank you, Lucy and Paul, for inviting me to speak today. It's very exciting to be here with all of you. I've been asked to provide a bit of legal context around diversity, equity and inclusion before Steph goes on to talk about the myriad benefits of exceeding these sort of minimum requirements that I'm going to cover. So the main bit of legislation that underpins diversity and inclusion at work is the Equality Act 2010. And if you know much about HR, this will probably be one of the first things you ever cover, is the 9 protected characteristics under the EQA. And they are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. And they are protected from 4 main types of discrimination. And when we talk about employees who are protected, it's worth pointing out, I think, that the definition of employees under the Equality Act is a little bit wider than maybe the definition of employees under some other legislation, because this will include sort of workers and apprentices and even potentially former employees as well. The first type of discrimination is direct, and that is when somebody is treated less favourably because of a protected characteristic. And there's a couple of little subcategories. So somebody who associates with someone who has a protected characteristic, so somebody who maybe has a disabled child, for example, that would be called associative discrimination, and they would be protected. Or somebody who's perceived to have a protected characteristic but actually doesn't. So maybe somebody who is subject to sort of homophobic harassment, but actually they aren't gay. And that's called perception discrimination. And this direct discrimination is generally unjustifiable. There are very, very limited exceptions, tend to be things like occupational requirements. So things like a women's refuge wanting to hire a female employee might be an occupational requirement. Indirect discrimination is a lot more common, and it's something that we see a lot more regularly, and it's where you put in place a seemingly neutral policy, but it has the effect of putting people with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage. And really common ways that we see people fall foul of this are things like having a blanket no flexible working policy and not considering things on a case-by-case basis. These can sometimes be justifiable if the policy is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. I'm not going to go too far into the depths of what that might be, but the advice line will always be able to help you to determine whether something might be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The third type of discrimination is harassment. And that is unwanted conduct that has the effect of violating dignity or creating a hostile environment. And that can occur even if the person who's complaining about it wasn't the person who was directly targeted. And that unwanted conduct often takes the form of things like banter and pranks. It might be excluding people. It can even be failure to act. So it might not be doing something, it might be failing to do something. And employers can be held vicariously liable in this instance for their employees' actions under a separate bit of legislation, the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. And the fourth type of discrimination is victimisation. And that protects employees who have suffered a detriment because they've made or supported a discrimination complaint. So they might have made a complaint themselves or supported somebody else. So perhaps they've acted as a witness, or perhaps they've attended a meeting accompanying somebody else. And the next slide is a table. Please don't be alarmed. I will explain it. It's not as complicated as it looks, I promise. So this table, if we can move on to the next slide, Paul, sorry. Thank you very much. So this table has the protected characteristics on the left, and along the top you've got the types of discrimination along with perception and associative, the two types that I talked about. And it's a really quick at-a-glance summary of the Equality Act. The first thing I want to point out is there are some gaps in the middle here, and I don't want you to worry about them too much. There are some things that aren't explicitly protected under the Equality Act, but you should bear in mind that there is always more than one way to skin a cat. So there might not be explicit protection for harassment under the maternity characteristic, but that claim would probably just take the form of a sex discrimination claim. So we shouldn't rest on our laurels just because something isn't explicitly protected. What I really wanted to talk about was this column on the right, because there are some additional forms of discrimination that apply to specific protected characteristics, and a couple of them come up quite regularly, particularly these ones under the disability protected characteristic. The first one is discrimination arising from disability, and I think this is probably a really common call that we get on the advice line. And this is the sort of thing where the discrimination hasn't arisen from the disability itself, but because of something that's related or caused by it. And you can imagine it might be something like lots of absences from work because somebody needs to have regular hospital appointments, or a change in behaviour or performance because of the medication someone's taking. And you can consider it to be a type of indirect discrimination. It can potentially be objectively justified, but you're probably going to want to seek some extra help from advice just to make sure that we can justify it and that's not something else we should be doing. The other one under disability is reasonable adjustments, and you're probably familiar with this requirement. So employers are required to make reasonable adjustments to support disabled employees. And in some instances, that might mean treating a disabled employee more favourably than a non-disabled employee. There's a small point under gender reassignment, and that is just that there is an additional claim there potentially if you treat absence that's due to gender reassignment less favourably than another absence, like for a standard illness. And then also there is some equal pay claims. So obviously men and women have the right to equal pay, and those claims are also made under the Equality Act under sex. And I want to talk about the consequences of getting it wrong, because this is really important. So there is no statutory limit on the amount of compensation that a tribunal can award for discrimination. And the award is made up of not only financial losses like future lost earnings and pension contributions, but there's also non-financial losses, and those are things like injury to feelings. The tribunal can also award additional aggravated damages if they feel that the employers acted in a malicious, insulting or oppressive manner, so they can escalate that. They can also award an uplift of up to 25% if you fail to follow the ACAS Code of Practice on disciplinaries and grievances and it was relevant. And then by the time interest and rounding up for tax are applied, you're looking at quite substantial awards for discrimination claims. The average award for discrimination claims in 2023 was £45,435, but the highest award for discrimination in 2023 was a staggering 4.6 million. The majority of that was earning potential and pension for the rest of that employee's working life, but £140,000 worth of it was made up of injury to feelings, aggravated damages and psychiatric injury. And on to the next slide, I just want to talk about the different roles that we have to play in identifying discrimination in the workplace. So it's really key that HR is able to identify discrimination risks, that they have knowledge of this, and that they have the wherewithal to challenge managers, that they're able to challenge managers and highlight the potential consequences of discrimination claims. All of your employees and your line managers need to be trained, and that training not only needs to happen, but it needs to be ongoing. If we train people once and then we don't look at it again for 10 years, we're not really taking the steps that we need to be taking to make sure this doesn't happen. So that's for the training in recognising and avoiding perpetuating discriminatory behaviour. And employers themselves, they need to be able to demonstrate that when they are carrying out those procedures, those disciplinaries, those dismissals, that they've carried out a fair procedure and that they've got documentary evidence of each step and that their decisions aren't based on sort of discriminatory factors. And it would be remiss of me to talk about the law as it pertains to equality and diversity without talking about potential future changes, because we have a new government. And there are significant changes to employment law relating to DEI anticipated. So I'm going to work through these quickly. I just want to head you off at the pass a little bit because I think I'm going to get loads of questions about these in the Q&A. And I have put pretty much all the information there is available in this table. These are just proposals. We have no further information about what sort of details might be given, how these things might work, or timeframes for when they might be implemented. So at this stage, they are just proposals. So from October 24, hopefully you're aware that there is a new proactive duty to take reasonable steps to protect employees from sexual harassment. And it looks like Labour intends to strengthen that, particularly for women who report sexual harassment. It seems that they may well later be protected as whistleblowers. Some changes to parental leave, sick pay and protection from unfair dismissal, which look like they will become day one rights. We have heard that there will be special rules about probationary periods, but I don't know what those will look like. The lower earnings limit and the waiting period for SSP are proposed to be removed as well. You're going to ask me some questions about this. Flexible working, the default for all workers from day one. If you are a bit with it in terms of HR, you'll be saying, Katie, this is a day one right. It has been since April 24. And that's true, but Labour seem to have introduced some new wording potentially. They want it to be a default for all workers from day one. We don't know what that means yet. Potentially it implies that there might be some changes to those reasons that currently you can rely upon to decline a flexible working request, but we're not sure. In terms of maternity and redundancy, a bit of an extension to that protected period. So it will be unlawful to dismiss a woman who's had a baby for 6 months after she comes back to work, with certain exceptions. Again, no details on what those exceptions might be, I'm afraid. I'm as intrigued as you are. In terms of equal pay, in addition to equal pay between men and women, the Equality, Race and Disability Bill proposes to enshrine that full right to equal pay law for disabled people and ethnic minorities as well. And it also proposes mandatory pay gap reporting. Carers leave, which is currently unpaid, looks to be proposed to be full paid. And in terms of menopause, there is a proposal for large employers to be required to produce menopause action plans that will set out how they'll support employees, much like gender pay gap action plans. And that is the end of all the proposed changes. And that's everything I have prepared for you. I hope you really enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of the Equality Act and how it underpins equality and diversity. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Steph in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph. As Paul said, I'm one of the diversity, equity and inclusion consultants at NatWest. I've been doing it for around about 15 years. Just before we start, just something I wanted to cover off is language and terminology is incredibly important in this space, the words we use. However, we may all have differing opinions on those words. So I'm going to use the words that I feel comfortable with, the terminology I like, but I recognize you may have different terms. I would also say, when we get to the Q&A, don't tie yourself up in knots over, oh, am I going to get the right terminology? Use the words that you feel comfortable with. The most important thing is that we get to answer your questions and hopefully help. Paul, can we jump to the first slide, please? So, so I thought it'd be nice to just share who I am and who I was. I'm a white, middle-aged, straight male. I come from a working class background. I do live with an underlying mental health condition. I've had it all my life, and it's treated through medication and me being sensible and looking after myself. So generally, it's very much under control. But I always worry when I talk about this subject that you might get the impression that I've always been inclusive in how I conduct myself and how I behave day to day. But that wouldn't necessarily be true. You know, I was born in 1970. I'm 54 now. I was born into a traditional working class family. I grew up in a council house. And at the time in the 70s, you know, homophobia, sexism, racism were very, unfortunately, alive and well. And I suppose, you know, there were times where my behavior and the language I used wasn't appropriate at all. I behaved in probably problematic ways. You could say I was a product of my environment in some ways. However, I always feel that I chose to behave that way as well. But there was always something inside me that never felt quite right. And that led me on a bit of a journey over the last number of years to the role that I do today. Go to the next slide, please, Paul. So I just wanted to touch on why organizations might be interested in this subject. And really what we mean by diversity, equity and inclusion. I think sometimes there can be misconceptions about it. Diversity for me is just about difference. We are all beautifully unique in our own way, a myriad of different ways, and not just the protected characteristics that Katie referenced, but also just in our experiences, our likes and dislikes. Are we a driver? Are we a reflector? All those things make us beautifully different, and that's super exciting. So that's when I think about diversity, I think about that difference. Equity isn't really about shoes, but it's the easiest way for me to explain it. I use a little bit of an analogy. So if you imagine a class full of children that do not have shoes, and the teacher decides to go out and buy all the children's shoes, they go out and they buy size 5 shoes, and every child in the class has got a pair of shoes. But obviously not all those children will have size 5 feet. That's what I would call equality. Everyone's getting the same thing. If we take the same scenario, but the teacher goes out and buys shoes for each individual child, you get a size 2, you get a size 3, you get a size 4. That's equity. It means each child has a pair of shoes that fits them. And this is this kind of concept that we can treat people differently, but to Katie's point, we just can't treat them less favorably. So what equity is doing is often in organizational context is removing additional barriers that people might face or catering to their needs in many ways. The last one is inclusion. To me, it's about coming to work, bringing your whole self to work. You're not hiding anything. And while you're at work, you feel fully included. You can fully participate. You can progress your career. You can share your thoughts and feelings, etc., etc. At the moment, all three of those are probably alive and well inside organizations. I think over time, maybe when we get better parity for everyone, equity may start to drift away. But right now, I think we need all of them. Can we jump to the next slide, please, Paul? You've seen this one already. I've kept it in because I think there is just an important point I wanted to make. Sometimes when we think about this subject, we can sometimes think about it, well, it pertains to, it's for women, or it's for people of color, or it's for disabled people, or the LGBT plus community. It's for everyone. The laws that Katie referenced protect us all. We're all equally protected. And these protected characteristics here, you will have a number of these that make you up as a human being. So I think just bear that in mind. It isn't a kind of about minority groups, it's about everyone. Okay, Paul, next slide, please. So why? So why do organizations focus on it? Katie has done an amazing job of covering off this legal imperative. And I think historically that was the case. Many organizations focused on it because legally they wanted to be compliant. The UK Equality Act is a powerful piece of legislation and we need to remain live to it. So I think most organizations quite rightly put a thoughtful around meeting their legal minimums. However, over time, I think we've worked out that actually, if you do this well and you're an inclusive organization, it makes you money, and we should never be ashamed of that. We're businesses. We're in the business to make money. If you are an inclusive organization, you will be able to recruit from the widest talent pool, which is incredibly important at a time when there's a war for talent. You will retain your colleagues because they will be happier at work because they feel fully included. Diverse teams are just simply better at solving problems. You get loads of different perspectives. You will come to a better solution at the end of the day. You'll be able to understand your customers better, thinking about, if you've got all your colleagues are beautifully different, they will have knowledge and experiences they can bring to the table, which will help you serve your customers. And that will lead to you accessing the widest customer pool where we know we can make money. And the last one I put in is just because. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We don't want to treat anyone less favorably because of the color of their skin, who they love, or if they live with an underlying condition. So, okay, Paul, next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk about a few things that I think should be, quite important if you're even setting sail on your diversity journey, or even if you're in the middle of it. These are things that I would probably encourage you to think about. Firstly, is not to see it as an additional extra. It's not something that you do on top of everything else you do as an organization. In fact, try to develop a really well understood business case. So how will doing this well help you attract, retain, and serve your customers so you can really meet those growth and financial ambitions you will have as an organization? It will help you do that. Set yourself some clear and tangible actions and measurable outcomes. We always say what gets measured gets done. So I think if you have nice, clear measures that everyone understands, things will get done. You might even consider, if you have values as a business, do you need to have an inclusivity value, which helps all your colleagues galvanize behind it and understand how they need to interact with each other and your customers every day. The ultimate aim is to be persistent and consistent with it. In many ways, this is cultural shift and it will take time. Next slide, please, Paul. Psychological safety. I sometimes think when we talk about this subject, we imagine in our minds an organization where everything is harmonious and everyone is getting on and it's all great. However, one of the business benefits of being an inclusive and a diverse organization is this concept of diversity of thought, to my point earlier about diverse teams coming up with better solutions. That means you're going to have colleagues who will have differing beliefs and perspectives and opinions. a psychological safe space is not about removing a sense of conflict. It's about getting everyone comfortable with the fact that we will disagree at times, but we do that in a thoughtful, kind, and considered way. It isn't about maintaining harmony, it's about using those differences to your advantage. This will mean that there will be times that you may work with colleagues who will have different perspectives to you, and it can be quite tempting to think, oh, I don't agree with their views, therefore I'm going to shut them off, I'm going to cancel them, I'm not going to engage with them. But I would encourage you to do the other thing, move towards that, and explore it together. It may just be the fact that you're dealing with some myths and misconceptions. So creating a psychologically safe space is key. Next slide, please, Paul. So Katie has talked about the UK Equality Act. In the Equality Act, it talks about positive action. And in simple terms, positive action is something that organisations can use to remove barriers, additional barriers that some groups face that others do not. So in other words, to use a sport analogy, create that level playing field so everyone can compete fairly. But the key with positive action is you first need to be able to identify where your problems are. And this is where data comes into it. If you have demographic data on your employees, remembering it is optional for colleagues and your employees to give you that data, that can help you understand, do you have any representation issues? You may have heard of many organizations working on gender and ethnicity right now. It's because they've looked at their demographic makeup, and you can imagine a pyramid. They've understood that the further senior you get in the organization, maybe the whiter it becomes, or there are fewer and fewer women in those senior positions. So that allows them to focus on what things can we do to change that. What I would say very quickly, when you're tackling the underrepresentation challenges, meritocracy is still very much alive. We're not just kind of grabbing a random woman or a random person of color and say, here's a senior job because we need to be more balanced. Meritocracy still applies. Next slide, please, Paul. Listen, so the demographic data that we talked about on the last slide is great because it can point you to there being maybe a problem, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why there is that problem. And this is where listening to your colleagues can be really, really powerful. Many organizations might use employee opinion surveys, and if you do so, that helps you understand the sentiment of how your employees feel. If you also include diversity-based questions in that survey, it means you can cut that data in a way to understand how different groups might feel. And it is not uncommon in organizations to find that minority groups, maybe a disabled population or people of color, might report lower engagement scores. So that kind of points you closer to where the problems might be. That gives you the opportunity to talk to them in a bit more detail to understand why they might feel that way. Again, it just allows you then to deploy positive action to overcome those barriers. What I would say is when you're developing those interventions, those things that might help remove those barriers, please engage those populations. They know better than anyone what their experiences are, and they can be so helpful in helping you work out what you might need to do as an organization. And that doesn't mean that your dominant group, if your dominant group is people like white middle-aged men like me, that doesn't mean they've not got anything to do. They can be allies. They if they're a dominant group, they carry a large amount of power in an organization, and they can be great allies to those minority groups. The next slide, please, Paul. So a journey. I think if it's maybe in your early days of looking at this, it can feel very overwhelming, and we might find ourselves looking at all these challenges that certain groups feel, and may think, well, we need to overcome them all, and we certainly do. We need to help everyone, but you cannot boil the ocean. I would say use your data, and that will point you to where your biggest bang for the buck will be, the things that you need to do first to help certain groups. In all likelihood, it won't be a straight line. Things won't go from not being great to being amazing like that. It may be a little bit of a rocky road. And in some ways, it can also feel like in the moment, the progress is not being made. It will be, but it might not feel that way because it does take time. I would encourage you to stop at certain points and look back and celebrate your successes, but maybe also acknowledge to your employee population, we've come a long way, we've done a lot of great stuff and things are getting better, but there's still more that we can do. Ultimately, I'm saying, like me, try and see it as a journey. That's all from me. I think we're going to go back to Paul now, maybe some questions.
Steph, Katie, amazing. It's such a labyrinth of a topic, and you guys can articulate your way around it with definite ease. But Lucy, have we got questions?
We have indeed, Paul. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Katie. Excellent presentations. First question, I'm going to come to you, Katie, if that's okay, please. And our question number 1 is, would an allergy be classed as a disability?
The short answer is yes, potentially, but that's not very helpful, is it? So I'll go into a little bit more detail. So the definition of a disability under the Equality Act is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. So an allergy is definitely going to be a physical or mental impairment. I'm not a doctor, and I know allergies can change over time, but I would generally assume that it probably would be long-term if you were to look into it, probably lasting long-term, or if it's something like hay fever, it's recurring. So I think it would fulfill that criteria as well. So it's going to come down to how much it affects that individual, so the severity and how it affects their day-to-day activities. So worth exploring, but yes, potentially. The thing I would say is, if you look at that definition and you still think, yes, it might meet that, you should probably treat them as if it did, because the last thing you want to do is end up in a tribunal arguing, no, they're not disabled. And the tribunal will decide ultimately whether this definition is met. But if you think it might be, then it's probably better to act as if it is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. Can I just expand on that a little bit further in terms of neurodivergence? Would that be something you would consider to fall under a protected characteristic for, in this case, disability, as you're talking about there?
Yeah, it probably would. Yeah, so you would definitely want to think about reasonable adjustments. I think there's a lot of reasons to think about reasonable adjustments, even if you don't think that you have anybody who's neurodivergent in your workforce, because I think lots of people don't know that they are. We know that there are barriers to getting diagnosed, cost and time and sort of knowledge, and I think also sort of perception. Sometimes people can be scathing. I think there's a public perception. So they may not know they're neurodivergent. And also I think some of the reasonable adjustments that we sort of recommend considering are things that will benefit everybody anyway. They're things like really clarifying like your conventions, so making sure that you're not assuming a certain level of sort of knowledge and you're really going into detail when you explain things, communicating tasks really clearly and things like that. They're just things that will benefit everybody, even if you don't think that you have somebody who's neurodivergent right now. And you probably do. I think it's quite a large proportion of the population. I reckon Steph's probably got that statistic on hand.
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, I reckon you know that.
They say, I've seen stats to say it's 1 in 7 would be neurodivergent. So that's quite a large population. What I would say that I think organisations for a number of years have probably got increasingly comfortable around the word disability and what they might do around increasing accessibility for their disabled customers or their disabled employees, and thinking about things, subtitles or ramps to get into buildings, all that kind of stuff. I think neurodivergence is something that's probably slightly more embryonic. It's not that it's new, but I think organizations are probably more earlier on in their journey. And I think that probably means education and awareness is going to be key, making sure that you're ready to think about those adjustments that Katie references to support someone who's neurodivergent in the workplace, but also that education with the wider employee population, so they can create an inclusive environment for that difference. It's probably one that organizations probably haven't done enough on at this stage, I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to put the next question to you, if I may, Steph, again. So one of our audience has commented on on your presentation, it was interesting to see class used as a description of a characteristic, which they wouldn't consider to be entirely relevant. Is this an important part of diversity, do you think, when we should be all trying to break down class barriers?
Yeah, I would say it is. It's probably, again, that's one that's slightly more emerging. You see many organisations now starting to do work around socioeconomic, and we are, for example. From speaking to one of my colleagues, Liam, who leads that agenda, who's amazing at it, there is real evidence to suggest people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds find it significantly harder to progress their careers. So again, it's another barrier that could be in someone's way in helping them be able to access career opportunities and progress that career in particular. I'm very open. I come from a working class background, but I probably have a job now that puts me in what I would consider a middle class group. I think it's something we still do need to talk about within the workplace, especially if it's something that is having negative impacts on someone's career aspirations and their journey. So I think increasingly organizations are turning their minds to it. I would encourage others to think about it as well. I also think, and this is a weird way, I suppose, no, it's not weird. I think it's important because maybe some of the other characteristics may not resonate with people, but I think when we start talking about socioeconomic background, it perks everyone's ears up and they all lean into the conversation because we all have positive and negative experiences of it. I always share when I do another session around bias. I grew up in a working class family. My dad was a dockyard worker, and he spent years as a kid bringing me up, teaching me anyone who spoke nice was a bit, they're posh and they've had an easy life. So he gave me this little bias, which is completely unfounded. It's that sense of reverse snobbery. So I think there is that. I think it needs to be part of the conversation, and I think organisations still need to focus on it.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really thought-provoking. Slight divergence on this, but a similar theme. Does our panel have any top tips or strategies or key things to consider where you may have a higher proportion of culturally diverse staff at core grades of service delivery being managed by a more white UK cultured staff?
Yeah, I suppose education is going to be key, and I'm sure Katie would have, jumped on that one. Education is going to be key. Something we've used on numerous occasions. Sometimes you think, oh, is all this diversity stuff going to cost you huge amounts of money, and are you going to have to do lots of complex things? Storytelling may seem a little bit twee, but it's really powerful. So encouraging colleagues to share their personal experiences is a form of education in itself. So having maybe those colleagues from more ethnically diverse backgrounds share their life stories and their experiences, which allows other populations to engage with them and understand the challenges they face. So I think education, and that can just be initially through storytelling to help people understand those barriers and challenges that other groups might be facing. Don't know if you have any further thoughts, Katie.
I think you've covered everything on that one, Steph. I'm sorry, I don't think I have anything to add.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, thank you, Katie. I was wondering if you were going to bring in that piece around the genuine occupational requirements, the idea around positive discrimination in order to try and redress any balances, which I think you need to be really careful about, everything should, I know we've had discussions where we've talked about everything should first and foremost be based on meritocracy.
Yes.
But equally, obviously, we do want to make sure we have balance, across our entire workforce. So I would be digging into, as Steph's already alluded to, it's one of those, micro biases, perhaps those unconscious pieces that are going on behind the scenes that have led to this scenario, and what can we be doing to really dig into why we have this, what can we do about it in a very positive and all-inclusive way?
And maybe checking into your recruitment practices as well. You know, where are you advertising? What requirements are you putting on your job descriptions? I know there's lots of companies who are sort of really reconsidering some of the maybe quite stringent application standards that they've had in terms of graduate schemes and things like that. You know, reassessing whether they need a 2-1 or a first, and whether they're cutting off talent because of that. So yeah, I think looking at those people coming into the company as well.
Yeah, brilliant.
You do touch on something quite important there, Lucy, around, you know, I suppose I've learned over the years, there's no silver bullet in this space. There's no one thing that you will do that will magically, you know, create an inclusive environment. But bias is something that we all kind of need to be very cognizant of, because it plays out every day. You know, we make around about 35,000 decisions in a given day. Many of them innocuous, like, you know, what toothpaste shall I use this morning? What shall I have, Frosties or Weetabix? But then others are, you know, significant. You know, how am I going to reward this employee for their performance this year? Who's going to get this job through interview? Who do I think is top talent in my organization? That's where bias can play out. Remember, bias is quite sneaky. It kind of comes up on you when you're tired, when you're thirsty, when you're hungry, when you're stressed, when you're busy. In those moments, it preys on you. And that's where you allow your subconscious to make those decisions. So I think, you know, of being very active in your decision making is key, and being cognizant that bias could play out. You know, as I'm open about my reverse snobbery bias, you know, I'm conscious of it and I carry it in my hand to challenge myself about it.
Yeah. No, I think this is exactly it. I think I'm seeing more clients bringing in policies around when they are interviewing, for example. They will do everything they can to make sure they have a diverse panel making that recruitment decision, you know, as a conscious step towards, you know, eliminating some of those biases. So I think it's not going to be suitable for everybody, but there are, you know, steps that people can start to take to help to balance that. So
Lucy,
all good stuff. Yes,
Lucy,
Paul.
can I ask a question?
Yeah, please
And
do.
I'm sure it might be useful for everybody on this webinar, but I have a number of clients that when I talk to them about equality, diversity, inclusion, they say, well, Paul, you know, we'd love to really embark on that, but I don't know where to start. We haven't got a champion. You've wrote a policy for us and helped us craft that, but how do we start? Where do we begin? Katie, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So, I mean, we kind of get calls from clients in that position all the time on the advice line, and sometimes they've got themselves into a bit of a pickle, and actually they're coming to us and something has happened, and they sort of haven't done anything previously to do with DEI or any sort of training, and some examples of things that have happened recently are sort of employees telling who's the comedian, John Davidson or something, like Jim Davidson, telling Jim Davidson jokes in the workplace, and really inappropriate things like that, and a series of things when you delve into it that have gone on in the past and have gone unchecked and unchallenged, and then you kind of reach a tipping point where employees start getting a bit tired and threatening to walk out and that sort of thing. So the first thing I would do if you're starting from nothing is you need to train people. You need to train your staff and managers. You need to make use of the resources that are available to you. And I can see that somebody's asked a bit of a question about the training resources as well. And somebody said, what do we do if some of the things that we can offer aren't really appropriate? So you have got, for everybody's benefit, there are e-learning modules that are included in your mentor subscription that include these topics that you can push to your staff. I would recommend doing them regularly as well. So probably reviewing them yearly rather than doing them once and then considering it a checkbox exercise and done. People do need sort of a refresher. If you don't want to do that, or if you think they need a bit more, we do consultancy and training. So there's training that you can book staff onto. If you've got a few staff that need it, then you can have somebody come to you and deliver it. We can do that as well. So that can be quite a cost-effective way of doing it. I saw that somebody asked in the question, what if we're a small company and we can't really afford that? And we've also got employees who maybe don't really gel with the whole e-learning thing. And obviously, you know, I can't wave a magic wand and come up with a way for you to do it. But I would, if I were in that situation, I'd probably have a think about whether I could train the trainer, whether I could have somebody internally, send them on some training to be able to deliver this in a cost-effective way, so we can deliver it internally and we can still do it in person, so that we're overcoming that sort of e-learning issue and overcoming the cost issue. I'd probably have a think about whether I could do that. Yeah. What I would do next, Paul, just in answer to your question, is once everybody's had that training, I'd make expectations really clear. So that would probably be a written communication, and I'd express what conduct is unacceptable and what the consequences are going to be of that conduct going forward. And I'd probably be saying that might include action up to and including dismissal without notice, gross misconduct dismissal. And then I'd walk the walk. So the next time it happens, you have to actually do something about it. So if you've walked past it previously, draw a line under it, make sure everybody's trained on what to recognise, and then actually do something about it next time it happens, which can seem a bit harsh. But that is how you're going to affect change. That is how people will learn what they can and can't say in the workplace. And unfortunately, at its bottom line, it's just about protecting people from being, from exposure to those really unnecessary things and those really horrible behaviours that make a workplace unpleasant.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Thank you, Katie. I think I picked up as well in that question as well. There was the comment about the staff themselves being very capable, and I think I'd be flipping this around as well. I'd be looking out into the workforce as to whether you have got any expertise or any passion that can help drive change, progress, or just starting the conversations. In a sensible and constructive way. So we hear the terms all the time now about inclusion champions, which includes having allies as well. You don't have to be part of this particular protected characteristic in order to be an absolute ally for it and be able to champion progress or discussions around that, and also thinking about at that more senior level whether you can have inclusion sponsors.
Yeah, that would be a big one for me, is that top of your house buy-in, prioritizing and demonstrating. Maybe it shouldn't be the case, but it is the case that in organizations, people will flock to what a leader feels is important. And if a leader is truly bought into this and will talk openly and actively about it on a regular basis, it will draw others into that discussion. It makes it important for everyone else. I would say that's a pretty important piece. And I would come back to that, truly understanding, if we get this right, how will it help us better serve our customers? So create and articulate, so everyone in the organization can galvanize behind it. We're doing this because it's good for us as a business, and it's good for us as people, and it's going to make us more profitable and help us serve our customers better. That would be an incredibly important part. And then using your data, so you are deploying positive action in the right way at the right time for the right reasons.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steph.
I just spotted a question on that I like, which someone who's anonymous has said about how do you tackle the eye roll.
I had my eye on you, Steph. I was like, oh, Steph's going to love this question. It's your bread and butter.
After doing this for 15 years, I've probably seen a lot of eye rolls in my time. There was, I've seen a number of things saying diversity, equity, and inclusion training doesn't work. It does. I think it's maybe more problematic when it's forced. So, it's a sheep dip everyone has to go through. And then that, it's important to set those standards to Katie's point, but that's maybe when you get the resistance. I think it's about understanding and appealing to those groups that might roll their eyes. Now, sorry, gentlemen, I'm going to pick on us a little bit here, and I don't mean this. I'm in your camp. it may be the case that maybe white middle-aged men might just, think, well, I don't really know what this has got to do with me. This is about women. This is about black people. This is about gay people. I don't know. But actually, you have an important part to play in this, and helping them understand what connections they might have to it. So, they're going to have daughters, they could have sons who could be gay, they may have parents who will develop disabilities as they age. So how they can understand their connections to it and recognizing that this is good for all of us and protects all of us in many ways. But it will be, a challenge, and I think it is cultural shift. It is going to take time to draw in those groups that may be less engaged in it than we would like. It's finding those hooks, those things that help them understand it. It does pertain to them. That's why I kept that slide, Katie's slide on protected characteristics, just to reiterate that point. This isn't just about protecting disabled people or a gay population. This is about all of us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Got a couple of questions, I think, for you, Katie, that have fired in. Is a blanket policy to require all job applicants to have the right to work in the UK when they apply potentially discriminatory, i.e. without considering the cost and time of sponsorship?
Mm-hmm. There are limits to how far mentor and my knowledge goes in terms of right to work, but yes, potentially. So my understanding is you need to look at the sponsorship requirements and whether the advertised role satisfies them or not. And I think that you need to be very careful in terms of, I don't think it would be a good idea to put in the advert that you will not sponsor. And I think that you need to consider on a case-by-case basis. I think a blanket, yes, the answer in short is yes, a blanket ban is going to be potentially discriminatory.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we've got to be really mindful here of, two totally separate legal requirements here. One which is the right to work in the UK, and one which is not to discriminate. And I don't think we should be, using one to sort of hide behind that in any way. So yeah, thinking really carefully about, your recruitment requirements. So we've got another question. One of our recent job adverts had high pressure environment and adapting to change, which made me as a partner of someone with anxiety not want to recommend my partner apply. Do recruiters need more training in interpretation of terms on job adverts?
What a good point. Yeah. And I always see those things and I wonder, what is that workplace like? Because I also think, when I see that sort of thing, does it need to be a high stress environment? I think there's a balance to be struck between, you always want to, when you're writing an advert for a role, to give a really realistic idea of what it's going to be like, because it will allow candidates to self-exclude if it's not the job for them. If you're not presenting it in the proper way, where people know what they're applying for, you're going to have a lot of candidates that aren't right for the role. That said, I think there are probably a lot of workplaces that are high stress when they don't need to be. And there are probably a lot of workplaces where they talk about sort of change and needing to be change ready when actually is change implemented well. And yeah, you will obviously, if you use those kind of words, exclude some people who will look at that and think, yeah, that's not for me. So consider whether that actually describes the workplace and the work, or whether it describes dysfunction in your workplace.
Yeah, I would, Kate, that's brilliant. I would have said, pretty much the same thing. It makes you question to an extent environment. I think one thing recruiters might need to do is when someone leaves a job, what we do is we go into a file on the, a Word document and brush down the previous role profile and say to a recruiter, get me another one of them. But you should be reviewing that job profile. Is that right? Is that what we now want? Is the language appropriate? Think about debiasing it. How can we make it welcoming, that everyone would be interested in it? And then allow the recruitment process, which is based on the meritocracy, to be thorough. And then you end up with the right candidate getting the job at the end of the day. I still see job adverts. I'm like, oh, I don't think I would have. I am also someone who lives with, because I'm a health condition, high levels of anxiety. And if I saw that, I'd be like, well, I don't know, that doesn't sound that doesn't sound great. One of my favourites was a job advert where I saw the line, "You will be at the coalface of the business," and I was like, I sat and thought about it. I was like, in my brain immediately, I started thinking about big, strong, hairy miners, men with pickaxes. I'm like, I don't know if that. I may be reading too much into this, but that doesn't seem overly inviting in some ways. So the words you use in those job adverts can turn someone on and off very, very quickly. Can
I
you
think
afford
that's
to do that?
I think that's an excellent point, Steph. What do we actually mean here? I think, as you both said there, you need to sell it, but you need to sell exactly what it is that you're talking about in a way that connects, as widely as possible. And again, as you say, not putting people off. Lovely comment here from someone. Is this good wording as we add these to our job adverts? Research shows that those in underrepresented groups tend to only apply if they tick every box. We're not about box ticking, so if you think you have what it takes but don't think you meet everything stated above, please still get in touch. I think that's excellent wording.
I
Love
love
that.
that. I love that a lot. It's great.
Love that. So another question we've had coming. Have we got time for one more, Paul? Is that okay?
We have one more, yeah. Here we go.
Do you have any advice for overseas workers and communications, as we have had instances of employees' communications coming across in a way which can be taken in a way that is upsetting, meaning that overseas workers need support with communication, so have made comments which have come across to others? How can we provide additional support?
My initial reaction would be, is to look at your comms partners or your communications managers. Have they recently gone through some diversity-based training or sensitization of some description to help them think through some of those communications? Engaging with those newer workers who might have found the communications challenging to find out why, what triggered, what caused a certain thing. But also, I think, how do I say this? I think we sometimes need to think about positive intent a little bit. I know it doesn't necessarily cover us from a legal perspective. We do need to be alive to that point. But I think sometimes we just need to kind of understand that there was a positive intention in the language that was used. And if someone wasn't comfortable with it, them feeling comfortable to challenge it, so this psychologically safe environment to have those conversations would be really important as well. And we do communicate in different ways, right? I work with a lot of colleagues from India, and sometimes because of to be fair, their grasp of English is better than mine most of the time. But it may be clipped, and I may read something into that sometimes, which there is nothing I need to read into it. It's just that it's slightly more clipped and a little bit more direct at times. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think building a culture where everyone is open to feedback is really important to underpin all of this. And again, it shows the importance of being able to have these conversations and not getting so caught up in the whole D&I space that actually we are unable to speak openly and freely, as you say, with positive intent, having obviously checked that we're not falling into any traps in terms of bias, unconscious or otherwise. But yeah, if someone's upsetting people, we need to be able to address that, and we need to be able to have sensible conversations about that.
Yeah, we need to make. We also think we also need to make this subject as accessible as we can, because if we, so I say at the start of my session, I'm going to use terminology I feel comfortable with. People will use different terminology. Don't get caught up in worrying about terminology when you ask questions, because often, I've come across people like, I don't really know how to word this, so I'm not going to say it. Well, that's not helpful. We need to say these things, and we need to have those conversations. Psychological safety, positive intent.
Lucy, 1 minute warning. Anything to wrap up?
That's me done. Thank you, Paul.
Amazing. So when we spoke with Steph and Katie a few weeks ago, me and Lucy were saying we could listen to these guys for hours just on this topic. It's endless and it's such a labyrinth. But everybody, thank you very much for attending. Again, if you just complete the short survey when this webinar closes down, you'll receive a copy of the slides and a link to the recording early next week. So we'll try and wrap it all up and you'll get this email out early next week. And for those of you who have pre-registered for the next webinar in Q4, the webinar is around well-being. We had a bit of an argument about whose responsibility it was. Is it HR? Is it health and safety? Is it something else in between? So the next one, I think, might turn into a bit of an argument. But nevertheless, it's been a pleasure to have you. If you need us, you know where we are. And again, a big thank you to Steph and Katie and my amazing co-host, Lucy. Cheers, guys.
Take care. Thank you very
All
much.
the best.
See you later.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.